I had 30 seconds before the leather check folder hit the table and the silhouettes in the hallway hit their targets. My grip was so tight that the red ink of the exclamation point seemed to bleed through the paper, staining my skin like a premonition. The atmosphere of the obsidian room was a lie, a curated symphony of clinking crystal and the low, velvet hum of powerful men discussing the fate of the city. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows like a warning, but inside, the air was still and heavy with the scent of aged scotch and expensive tobacco. I moved toward the corner booth, my breath hitching as I felt the weight of the cold viper's presence before I even reached him. Lucien Vale sat with his head slightly lowered, his posture as rigid as a loaded spring. He wore a dark suit that seemed to absorb the dim light, looking every bit the man who ruled through calculation and restrained anger. He looked like he was already waiting for a strike, but he was looking in the wrong direction. Behind him, the blurred silhouettes of his guards, men I'd served for months, shifted into positions that weren't meant for protection. They were closing the circle. To them, I was just a tray in a uniform, a ghost in a white apron. But as I slid the receipt toward his hand, my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't just bringing him the bill. I was handing him his life, wrapped in a piece of thermal paper. The air in the VIP lounge of the Obsidian was thick with the scent of aged cedar and the kind of silence that only extreme wealth can buy. I moved through the room like a ghost, a skill I perfected over 3 years of serving men who looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. My uniform was crisp, my expression a mask of professional boredom, but beneath the starched fabric, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I approached the corner booth, the one tucked deepest into the shadows, where the light of the crystal chandelier couldn't quite reach. My tray held a single crystal carafe of chilled mineral water. Lucien Vale, the cold viper, sat at the head of the table. Up close, the restrained power radiating from him was physical, a cold pressure that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He didn't look up as I leaned in to refill his glass. His focus was entirely on the man to his left, his second-in-command, Elias. "The shipment arrives at midnight," Lucien said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the very air in the room. "Everything is prepared," Elias replied, but his hand flicked a nervous glance toward the heavy velvet curtains near the service entrance. I moved to the next glass, my movements fluid and practiced. As I leaned over to reach the far side of the table, the heavy drapes shifted. Through the narrow gap of the service door, I caught the reflection in the polished brass kickplate. 2 men were standing in the narrow hallway, Lucien's own men. They weren't watching the perimeter. They were checking their silenced sidearms, their eyes fixed on the back of Lucien's head. "He's a dead man walking." A sharp whisper drifted through the crack in the door, barely audible over the soft jazz playing in the lounge. It was Victor, the head of Lucien's security detail. "As soon as the check hits the table, we move. 5 minutes. No more, no less." "And the girl?" another voice hissed. "Collateral. Don't let her leave the floor." The water in the carafe sloshed dangerously as my hand gave a microscopic jerk. I forced my muscles to lock, finishing the pour with agonizing slowness. I was invisible, yes, but I was also trapped. The very men who were supposed to be the Viper's shield had become his shroud. I stepped back, tucking the tray under my arm, my mind racing through a haze of terror. My father's medical bills, my rent, my quiet life. It all hung in the balance of the next 300 seconds. I looked at Lucien. He looked so certain, so untouchable, completely unaware that the shadows behind him had grown teeth. I had 5 minutes to decide if I would remain a witness to a murder or a participant in a war. I turned toward the terminal to print the receipt, my hands trembling so violently I had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. 5 minutes. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was counting down to my own end. The thermal paper felt like a live wire in my hand as I stood behind the service station, shielded from view by a heavy marble pillar. My breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that threatened to rattle my chest. I reached into my apron pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic of a red felt-tip pen, a tool I usually use to mark allergies or special requests. Now, it was the only weapon I had to stop a massacre. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, I pressed the nib to the back of the receipt. The red ink bled into the paper, forming a sharp, jagged exclamation point that looked like a fresh wound. Beneath it, I scrawled 3 words in frantic, sloping script, "They're in position." I folded the slip once, hiding the warning, and tucked it into the small leather presenter. As I stepped back out into the open floor of the lounge, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The silhouettes in the hallway had stilled, their predatory focus locked on the back of the Viper's head. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the silent command to stay away, to let the clock run out. My shoes made no sound on the plush carpet as I approached Lucien's table. The air around him was different now, colder, heavier, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. As I reached the edge of the mahogany table, I didn't just set the bill down. I slid it directly toward his right hand, the one resting inches away from his crystal glass. Then, for the first time in 3 years of service, I broke the golden rule of the invisible waitress. I looked him directly in the eye. Lucien's head lifted slowly. His expression was a masterpiece of controlled ice, his jaw set in a line of rigid authority that suggested he was a man who expected obedience and delivered consequences. But as our gazes locked, his focused, calculating eyes narrowed. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a girl whose pupils were blown wide with terror, whose throat was working in a hard, visible swallow. The silence between us stretched, a taut wire vibrating with unspoken tension. His hand moved, his long, blunt fingers hovering over the leather folder. He didn't look at the check yet. He remained fixed on me, searching my face for the source of the frantic energy radiating off my skin. In that second, the cold Viper lived up to his name. His stare was a physical weight, stripping away my professional mask until I felt raw and exposed. I didn't look away. I couldn't. I held his stare with a silent, desperate plea, my heart screaming the warning my lips couldn't utter. Finally, his fingers clamped onto the presenter, and I knew there was no going back. I had just handed the devil a map out of hell. Lucien's fingers flipped the leather presenter open with a practiced, lethargic grace. His gaze dropped to the receipt, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. I watched the muscle in his jaw feather, the only outward sign that the cold Viper had felt the strike. He didn't stiffen. He didn't gasp. He simply became something else. The restrained anger that had been simmering beneath his skin suddenly turned into a predatory, freezing vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the booth. He didn't reach for a gun. He reached for his wine glass. As he tilted the crystal back, his eyes shifted toward the reflection in the dark liquid, tracking the movement of the shadows behind him. In one fluid, violent motion, Lucien slammed the base of the glass onto the mahogany table. The crystal shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the hushed lounge. Before the first shard could hit the carpet, the surgical strike began. Lucien didn't stand. He exploded upward, spinning with a jagged stem of crystal still gripped in his hand. Elias, the man who had been whispering betrayals only moments ago, didn't even have time to reach for his holster before Lucien drove the glass into the soft meat of his forearm, pinning his hand to the table. A choked scream died in Elias's throat as the Viper's other hand swept across the table, seizing a heavy silver steak knife. The silhouettes in the hallway lunged forward, but Lucien was already moving. He used Elias as a human shield, dragging the traitor into the line of fire. The first silenced shot from the hallway thudded into Elias's shoulder, a dull, wet sound that made my stomach churn. The restaurant erupted into a choreographed nightmare of muffled pops and shattering plates. Lucien's real loyalists, men I hadn't even realized were staged at the bar, descended on the hallway attackers with the terrifying efficiency of a pack of wolves. It wasn't a brawl, it was an execution. I stood frozen, the tray still tucked under my arm, as the air filled with the sharp scent of gunpowder and copper. Lucien stepped over Elias's collapsing form, his dark suit unstained, his expression returning to that mask of rigid, terrifying calm. He didn't look at the carnage he'd just unleashed. He looked at me. The chaos around us seemed to fade into a blur of out-of-focus violence. He walked toward me, his steps heavy and deliberate. The cold viper reached out, his hand, now spotted with a single drop of red that wasn't ink, clamping firmly around my upper arm. "The check is paid, Emma," he rasped, his voice vibrating with a dark, newfound interest. "Now we're leaving." He didn't ask. He didn't give me a choice. As he hauled me toward the service exit, the receipt, marked with my red exclamation point, lay on the floor, soaked in the blood of the men who had underestimated us both. The transition from the velvet-lined opulence of the restaurant to the cold, industrial steel of the elevator felt like a descent into another dimension. Lucien didn't speak as the lift climbed toward the penthouse of a nondescript glass tower, a fortress disguised as a residence. His hand never left my arm, his grip a constant, bruising reminder that I was no longer a bystander. I was evidence. When the door slid open, I was met with a sprawling expanse of concrete and glass. There were no soft edges here, no warm colors. The Viper's Nest was a monochrome sanctuary of high-tech surveillance and heavy shadows. Lucien finally released me, pacing toward a wall of monitors that flickered with live feeds of the city below. He looked like a man trying to outrun a ghost, his rigid posture finally showing the slightest tremor of a hunt beginning. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward a low leather chair. He didn't look at me. He was focused on a frozen frame of the restaurant's security footage. "I have to go back," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and alien in the vast room. "My shift. My father's medication is in my locker." Lucien turned then, and the expression on his face silenced me. The restrained anger from the restaurant had sharpened into something more analytical, more dangerous. "You think you can go back to pouring water after what you did?" He stepped into my space, his presence looming over me like a storm front. "Every man in that hallway who survived knows your face. You didn't just save my life, Emma. You signed away your own." He walked back to the monitors, stabbing a finger at a blurred silhouette in the corner of the frame. The head of his security, Victor. They were out of focus. My own men. My own blood. He turned his head slightly, his eyes tracking me with predatory intensity. "But you weren't out of focus. You were in the hallway. You saw who signaled the hit before the check ever hit the table. You saw the one who nodded to Victor. I realized then why I was here. I wasn't a guest or even a victim in his eyes. I was a recorder, a human camera that had captured the one thing his digital eyes had missed, the moment of the true betrayal. You are the only person who can identify the architect of this coup," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "Until I know every name, you don't leave this site. You don't breathe air I don't provide." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights, feeling the weight of the penthouse pressing down on me. I had traded the invisibility of a waitress for the cage of a king. The cold viper was no longer just a legend from the news. He was my only shield and my new jailer. The silence of the penthouse was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of Lucien's fingers against the mahogany desk. He had been digging into the why behind the betrayal while I sat huddled on the leather sofa, the adrenaline of the restaurant shootout fading into a cold, hollow exhaustion. "Elias and Victor were just the blades," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They were bought. But the man who held the purse strings is someone who specializes in a very specific kind of leverage." He swiped a tablet across the desk toward me. On the screen was a dossier for a man named Julian Vane, a shark who swam in the murkiest depths of the city's high-stakes gambling rings. But it wasn't Vane's face that made the floor fall out from under me. It was the attachment clipped to the bottom of the file, a list of outstanding debts marked for immediate collection. Halfway down the list, scrawled in cold, digital ink, was my father's name. The room seemed to tilt. "My father," I breathed, the words barely catching in my throat. I saw the figures next to his name, numbers so high they didn't even look real. It wasn't just medical bills. It was a mountain of gambling debt I never knew existed, a weight he had been carrying in silence while he withered away in that hospital bed. Lucien leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the color drain from my face. Vane doesn't just collect money, Emma. He collects lives. He's been using your father's debt to squeeze information out of anyone connected to my inner circle. He knew exactly which waitress worked the VIP booth tonight. He knew exactly who would be invisible enough to overhear a plan and too terrified to speak up. He was counting on me being a coward. I whispered, a spark of hot, stinging anger finally piercing through my fear. He was counting on you being a victim, Lucien corrected, his gaze hardening. He holds the keys to your father's life. If Vane wins, your father is a dead man. If I fall, there is no one left to stop him from clearing that debt with your father's blood, or yours. I looked at the red mark I'd left on the receipt, still sitting on the corner of Lucien's desk like a bloody relic. I had thought I was saving a stranger. I realized now that I had been fighting for my own blood all along. The cold viper wasn't just my protector anymore. He was the only man capable of burning down the debt collector who owned my family's soul. What do we do? I asked, my voice finally steadying, the passivity of the waitress beginning to flake away like old paint. Lucien stood, the restrained anger in his eyes shifting into something focused and lethal. We stop being the prey, Emma. We're going to pay Mr. Vane a visit. And we aren't bringing cash. In the days that followed, the penthouse stopped being a cage and became a classroom. Lucien didn't treat me like a guest. He treated me like an instrument that needed tuning. He stripped away my waitress's apron and replaced it with tailored silks in shades of midnight and charcoal, the clean-cut aesthetic of his world. But the clothes were just a shell. The real transformation happened in the way he forced me to look at the world. The greatest mistake you can make, Emma, is looking at a person, Lucien said, his voice a low vibration in the dimly lit training room. He stood behind me, his hand steadying my chin as he forced me to look at the bank of monitors displaying live feeds of the city's most crowded plazas. People lie. Their posture, their gait, their distance from the exit. Those are the only truths they have. He pointed to a man in a blurred silhouette standing near a subway entrance. Tell me what you see. He's waiting for someone. I replied, my voice gaining a confidence I didn't yet feel. Look closer, Lucien rasped, his chest inches from my back, the scent of cedar and cold steel enveloping me. He shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. His right hand is tucked into his pocket, but the shoulder is dipped. He's not waiting. He's anchoring. He's a lookout for someone else. Hour after hour, he drilled me on the language of the silhouette. He taught me how to identify a concealed weapon by the way a jacket draped, how to spot a traitor by the way they avoided his direct line of sight, and how to remain invisible even when standing in the center of the room. He was turning my greatest weakness, my habit of staying quiet and blending into the background, into a lethal surveillance asset. You were the only one who saw the gunman in the hallway because you were trained to anticipate needs, he murmured, his fingers trailing a slow, deliberate path down my forearm to my wrist. Now, I'm training you to anticipate threats. You are the shadow I didn't know I had. As I watched my own reflection in the glass, I realized the girl who had trembled while marking a receipt was disappearing. My posture was becoming as rigid as his, my eyes focused and hard. I was no longer looking for water glasses to refill. I was looking for the twitch of a finger or the break in a rhythm. Behind the silhouette of the waitress, something sharper was beginning to emerge. I was learning to breathe in the cold, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was becoming part of it. The transition back into the apron felt like stepping into the skin of a person I no longer knew. The gilded lotus was as shimmering and hollow as ever, but tonight, the weight under my uniform wasn't a tray of drinks. It was the cold, flat transmitter taped against my ribs and the knowledge that I was the center of a spider's web. Lucien's voice hummed in my ear, a ghost in the static of the tiny earpiece hidden by my hair. Breathe, Emma. You're just a waitress. You're invisible. Remember that. I moved through the floor with the same fluid grace Lucien had spent weeks perfecting. My eyes, however, were no longer searching for empty glasses. I was scanning the room for the specific dip of a shoulder, the nervous anchor of a foot, the out-of-focus details that signaled a predator in wait. My target was table 4, Julian Vane's personal emissary, a man who believed he was here to finalize the takeover of Lucien's territory. As I approached, the air around the table curdled with the smell of expensive tobacco and cheap intent. Vane's man, a thick-necked enforcer named Graves, didn't even look at me as I set down the menus. "The Viper's dead," Graves muttered to his companion, his voice a low, jagged rasp that the wire caught perfectly. "Vane's got the girl's father in the warehouse. Once the final signatures are forced, we burn the hospital records and the old man with them." My hand didn't shake. I felt the familiar heat of the red felt-tip pen in my pocket, but I didn't reach for it. I stood there, pouring the sparkling water, my face a mask of practiced vacancy. Inside, I was recording every word, every name, every location. I was no longer the prey being squeezed by a debt. I was the bait that had already been swallowed. "He's at the Coaster estate," Graves continued, leaning in closer. "Tonight's the handover. The Viper's inner circle is already there, waiting for the signal." "That's enough," Lucien's voice crackled in my ear, dark and satisfied. "Leave the check, Emma. Your work here is done." I slid the bill onto the table, the same leather presenter that had started this war. Graves didn't notice the way I looked at him, a cold, focused stare that he was too arrogant to feel. I walked away from the table, my heart no longer hammering, but beating with the steady, lethal rhythm of the man waiting for me in the car outside. I had walked into the restaurant as a spy, but as I passed through the service exit for the last time, I knew I was leaving as an executioner's shadow. The invisible girl was dead, and the Viper was hungry. The Coaster estate was a fortress of limestone and arrogance, illuminated by floodlights that turned the falling sleet into shards of glass. Inside the grand study, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Julian Vane sat behind a desk of carved oak, flanked by the remnants of Lucien's compromised security. He looked like a man who had already won, his fingers steepled as he watched the cold Viper walk into the center of the room, unarmed and alone. "You're late for your own funeral, Lucien," Vane said, his voice oily with triumph. "I trust you've come to sign over the holdings. Your men have already transitioned. Your empire is a ghost." Lucien stood in the center of the Persian rug, his posture as rigid and controlled as the day I first met him. He didn't look at the guns pointed at his chest. He looked at Vane with a terrifying, hollow calm. "I'm not here to sign anything, Julian. I'm here to settle a debt." "With what?" Vane laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You have nothing. Your accounts are frozen, your enforcers are mine, and that little waitress you tried to hide is likely halfway to a shallow grave by now." I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains in the corner of the room. The movement was silent, a shadow detaching itself from the dark, just as Lucien had taught me. I wasn't wearing an apron. I was draped in a tailored black coat, my hair swept back to reveal a face that no longer knew how to flinch. The room went deathly still. Graves, standing by the door, reached for his weapon, but he froze when he saw the small, silver detonator held firmly in my right hand, the link to the charges Lucien's loyalists had placed under Vane's server farm 10 minutes ago. In my left hand, I held a single leather presenter. I walked toward the desk, my gaze fixed on Vane. He looked at me, then at the wire peeking from my collar, and finally at the cold, calculating expression in my eyes. The invisible girl was gone. In her place was the Viper's shadow. "The check is due, Mr. Vane," I said, my voice steady and low, echoing the gravelly authority of the man standing behind me. I slid the presenter across the oak desk. Inside wasn't a bill for dinner. It was a printed log of every offshore account Vane had used to bribe Lucien's men, every recorded whisper from the restaurant wire, and a final notice of the total liquidation of his assets. It was the evidence of his failure, marked at the bottom with a bold, red exclamation point. Vane's face went the color of ash. He looked up at Lucien, then back at me, realizing too late that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the man with the reputation. It was the waitress who had been watching him all along. "You saved the wrong man, girl," Vane hissed, his voice trembling. "No," I replied, looking at Lucien as he stepped forward to reclaim his throne. I just made sure the right one stayed alive to finish the job. The silence that followed the confrontation was heavier than the gunfire that preceded it. Julian Vane sat frozen, staring at the red exclamation point on the receipt like it was a death warrant. Around the room, the men who had once been loyal to him looked at the detonator in my hand, then at the cold Viper standing beside me, and slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. The coup hadn't just failed. It had been dismantled by the very girl they'd intended to discard. "The debt, Julian," Lucien said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that vibrated in the small of my back. "Settle it. Now." Vane's hands shook as he pulled a secondary laptop from a hidden drawer. Under Lucien's predatory gaze, he navigated the encrypted ledgers of his empire. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, my eyes never leaving Vane's face. I watched as he pulled up my father's file, the mountain of debt that had kept me small and invisible for so long. "Delete it," I commanded. My voice didn't waver. It was cold, sharp, and carried the weight of a woman who had finally learned the value of her own shadow. Vane hesitated, a flicker of his old arrogance returning, until Lucien stepped into the light of the desk lamp, the shadows on his face deepening into something monstrous. With a frantic series of keystrokes, Vane struck the entry. I watched the digital numbers zero out. In the eyes of the underworld, my father was finally a free man. But I knew the truth. Freedom in this world wasn't given, it was seized. "It's done," Vane whispered, looking broken. "Not quite," I said. I reached across the desk, picking up the heavy fountain pen Vane had intended to use for Lucien's surrender. I didn't hand it to Lucien. Instead, I uncapped it and scrawled my own name across the final page of the ledger, marking my place in the new order. The ink was dark, permanent, and bold. Lucien looked at the signature, then at me, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first I had ever seen. He turned to the remaining men in the room, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Emma is no longer a guest. She is the ink that writes our history. Anyone who looks at her sees me. Anyone who touches her finds only the Viper." As Lucien's loyalists moved in to clear the room of traitors, I felt the last of the Waitress's fear evaporate. The debt was gone, replaced by a different kind of bond. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, stained with nothing but ink. I had started the night as a girl delivering a bill, but as the blood began to spill in the hallway to settle the final scores, I realized I was finally home. I wasn't just surviving the dark, I was ruling it. The penthouse windows overlooked a city that looked like a map of glowing circuits, but tonight, I wasn't looking at the view from the outside in. I was the one at the center of the pulse. A year ago, I would have been moving through a room like this with a silver tray, eyes down, breath held, hoping to remain unnoticed. Now, I stood at the edge of the glass, the Chicago skyline reflecting in my eyes, wearing a dress the color of a bruised sky. I didn't hide in the shadows anymore. I commanded them. Behind me, the silhouettes of the security detail stood in a rigid, silent line. I didn't need to turn around to know that Victor's replacement was watching the door, or that the man by the elevator had shifted his weight to the balls of his feet, ready to move. I could hear the rhythm of the room, the language of the silhouettes, as clearly as a heartbeat. They weren't just guards. They were an extension of my own reach. Lucien stepped up beside me, his presence a familiar, heavy warmth. He didn't wrap an arm around me or offer a comforting word. He simply stood there, his shoulder nearly brushing mine, two predators looking out over a kingdom that had tried to devour us both. He looked at the city, then turned his focus to me, his gaze no longer just calculating, but filled with a dark, profound recognition. "The girl who handed me that receipt would be terrified of this height," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that echoed the wind howling against the glass. "That girl died in the kitchen of the Lotus," I replied, my voice steady, carrying the weight of the authority I had earned in blood and ink. "She was invisible because she was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore." I looked back at the men standing in the shadows of the room. With a small, almost imperceptible tilt of my head, I signaled for them to clear the floor. They moved instantly, a silent, disciplined retreat that left only Lucien and me in the vast, glittering space. I wasn't just the woman who had saved the cold viper. I was the one who kept the blade sharp. My father was safe, the debts were ash, and the world that had once ignored me now held its breath when I entered a room. As Lucien reached out, his hand, once a symbol of my imprisonment, clasping firmly onto mine, I realized the transformation was complete. The invisible waitress was a ghost, and in her place stood a queen of the concrete and the cold, ruling the empire alongside the man who had taught her how to bite back. Outside, the winter wind continued to scream, but inside, there was only the silence of absolute power. We weren't just survivors. We were the storm.